A journalist visiting America in 1860 wrote, "There are several kinds of power working at the fabric of this republic: water power, steam power, and Irish power. The last works hardest of all. Irish Americans continue to power America, from building our infrastructure, to healing the sick, to rushing into harm's way as others run out. Irish names are prominent on all rolls of valor, including 257 recipients of the Medal of Honor that list Ireland as their birthplace. Without Irish Americans, Helen Keller would not have had her miracle worker. The marginalized would have lost a voice. We would not have been challenged to reach for the moon. But the most significant contribution of Irish Americans is the story of a people who arrived from homeland with little more than energy and determination, who have contributed and excelled in every aspect of American society, defining the American dream. March is Irish American Heritage Month.
Welcome to another Irish American Heritage Month webinar presented by the Ancient Order Hibernians America. Today's topic is how the Irish created a new urban culture with James R. Barrett, Professor Emeritus, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Our host is National Historian Daniel Taylor. Take it away, Brother Taylor.
Thank you, Danny, and welcome everyone to the second of our Irish Heritage Month webinars for 2022. This past Saturday, we had with us Professor Cian McMahon, who shared with us some of the research and findings that went into his 2021 book, The Coffin Ship: Life and Death at Sea During the Great Irish Famine. And if you were not with us on Saturday, you can find that webinar now on the AOH YouTube channel. But Professor McMahon provided fascinating insight into the experiences of the incredible number of Irish people who made the passage to North America in the 1840s during An Gorta Mór, the Great Hunger. Well, tonight we jump ahead a generation or two, and we find that immigration from Ireland continued at a large scale following the Great Hunger, such that some 3 million Irish men, women, and children entered the United States between 1840 and 1890. Once here, these Irish immigrants married, had families, and facilitated the immigration of others from back home until there were more Irish here in the United States than there were in Ireland. Significantly for tonight's program, these Irish immigrants settled mostly in our cities. And in fact, as quoted by our special guest tonight, the writer Peter Quinn has observed that the Irish went from being the most rural people in Western Europe to being the most urbanized people in North America. And this urban concentration of huge numbers of Irish in our cities had wide-ranging and long-lasting consequences to the Irish Americans, to immigrant groups who came to our shores after the Irish, and to the shaping of our shared American culture. When non-Irish immigrants arrived in the late 19th and early 20th century, they found in our cities Irish cops and firemen, Irish saloon keepers, Irish aldermen, and Irish mayors. When they went to church, they found Irish priests and Irish nuns, and the diocese was probably overseen by an Irish bishop. When their children went to Catholic schools, they found Irish religious teaching their children. Our presentation tonight explores the relations between the Irish and these later settling immigrants and the impact that the Irish Catholic paradigm had on the so-called Americanization of other immigrant groups. Our guest tonight, Professor James R. Barrett, is the author of the classic study of this subject. First published by Penguin Books in 2012, The Irish Way: Becoming American in the Multi-Ethnic City remains in print as a must-read for those interested in the Irish American experience and 20th century urban culture. Professor Barrett is Professor Emeritus of History and African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and is a scholar in residence at the Newberry Library in Chicago. He was born and raised in Chicago, fittingly enough, the son of a policeman. In addition to The Irish Way, our guest is also the author of From the Bottom Up and the Inside Out: Race, Ethnicity, and identity in working class history. He is presently working on Chicago, A People's History. And with that, Professor Barrett, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Danny and Dan. I appreciate the invitation tonight. The book that Dan just mentioned deals with the Irish Americans, of course, but also with their relations with other ethnic and racial groups. And it's set in several venues, in several urban spaces. At the beginning of the talk this evening, I just wanted to refer to those briefly, so we get some idea of the scope of Irish American influence, particularly in cities, and particularly in relation to these other groups. So this includes the city street, for example. It also includes the Catholic Church, the political machine. And what I wanted to talk mostly about tonight, the stage, by which I mean the popular culture of the city. And so I'll give a very brief kind of overview of some of these spaces and then talk a little bit more about popular cultural performance. And I think that this part, the Irish on the stage, if you will, is probably more profound than we might guess. Through minstrelsy, which we'll refer to briefly, the music hall, vaudeville, the vaudeville stage, Tin Pan Alley, that is their music, theater, fiction. In all these ways, the Irish help to interpret the multi-ethnic city, and also, I would argue, to socialize those migrant peoples that followed them. And so, in that sense, at least, I would argue that the Irish are really the original ethnic group in the United States, and the followers tended to be influenced a lot by the path that the Irish laid out. Our focus, Dan mentioned it in introduction, is often on the famine generation. And that experience indeed left a deep imprint on the early immigrants in the period 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. And also, it should be said, in Irish communities well beyond those years, through music, poetry, and the oral tradition. Dan referred to the fact that there were 5 million first and second generation Irish in the United States by the end of the 19th century. That's more than you would have found in Ireland. At which point there were I wanted us to think about that later generation. One way of putting it is the Irish that were formed less by the Irish countryside and the village and the farm, and more by the large city. I think if we take a look at that, what you find is a tremendous influence that Irish Americans had, particularly in the urban environment. This is an image of later immigrants. Sometimes the term that's used to describe these immigrants arriving in the late 19th century and the early 20th century is the new immigrants. And this is, if anything, a much larger wave of people, although from many different places. We have the Ukraine in mind a lot these days. People also came, of course, from Poland and from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Italy, and so on. And these were the people that shared the city and industrial town with the Irish and found the Irish, it seemed, everywhere. And one of the arguments I wanted to leave you with tonight is that as important as the Irish are as a particular ethnic group, the real drama, I would argue, in immigration history is in the relations between the Irish and these later groups. And one of the places I think we'll see that this evening is on stage in various forms of popular culture. I wanted to, before looking at any of these spaces in the city, give you an image of the Americanized Irish. So this is a shot of an Irish family all dressed up. This is in the 1920s. I don't have exactly the year, but the impression is clear. They're settled in, they're comfortable in the American city, and they look prosperous, and many were. The Irish did well in the United States once settled in. But I also wanted to remind people that for my period, I'm talking about the period of, let's say, roughly the first half of the 20th century, this is an overwhelmingly working class population. They're rising, but it's that rise, of course, that's part of the story that we're interested in. And so here, very briefly, are the spaces, the venues in which the Irish encounter other groups, and I would argue play an extremely important role in acculturating later groups, and in the process between them and their multi-ethnic neighbors, really create a new urban culture. So one of these venues, obviously, is the Catholic Church. The church in this period that I'm talking about is dominated among the clergy and the hierarchy by the Irish. And this is a highly hierarchical institution, I would remind people. So I think that that's of great significance in itself, but maybe of more influence on a sort of everyday basis and at a street level is the fact that the institutions of the church, the schools, of course, but also orphanages and other institutions, were really staffed largely by Irish Catholic clergy, and so nuns and priests. And whereas in Ireland, processions, the one we're looking at right here is a May procession, for the Virgin in Boston in 1927. And unlike the processions in Ireland, out in the countryside or in small villages, we came into Cork one year on Corpus Christi Sunday and found a giant procession going through the countryside as we were hitchhiking through that part of Ireland. These processions are in the streets, and it reminds us that the Irish Catholic Church in the United States was a church of the streets. It was a church of the city. That's where the overwhelming majority of Irish immigrants landed, and it's also the place where most other immigrant peoples landed. A second venue, the industrial workplace, and especially the unions. This happens to be a shot of the Calumet Steel region in South Chicago and around the bottom of the lake in northeastern Indiana, heavy industry. And here, the immigrants and other migrant peoples encountered the Irish, of course, as foremen and as straw bosses. They're settled in as the new industrial workers or immigrant workers are coming in, but above all, as elected union officials. And often the union was the place that immigrant workers first encountered democratic organization and governance. So it was another way in which new people learned the ropes in the United States, in this case, organization, social movements, and politics. And in terms of politics, the political machine is the other place to look. However, briefly this evening, it's a huge topic, and many people will be familiar with the way this is usually thought about in terms of corruption, duplicity, and so forth. But I wanted to remind people that it's also the political machine, city machine, is also an instrument of Americanization. It's a place where new people were acculturated, in this case, in terms of the politics, the power relations of the city. And for most of that period that I'm talking about, I would say well into the 20th century, probably closer to the mid 20th century, many city political machines are led, if not dominated, by the Irish. We have here on the left, these are two of Chicago's Irish Machine politicians. On the left is Michael Hinky Dink Kenna, and on the right, Bathhouse John Coughlin. And the impact of the machine can be measured through much of the 20th century. And eventually what you wind up with is an inter-ethnic machine. I think this is what you'll find in most cities. And yet in Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, other places, you'll still find the Irish in important political positions in these machines. And so finally, the slide here is on the stage, the following slide. And this is the area that I wanted to concentrate on mostly tonight, partly because it's less obvious than some of these others. And I think that you can trace back the popular culture influence of the Irish all the way back to minstrelsy. The slide that we're looking at right now has a blackface minstrel on the left here. This is an Irish performer, but he's in blackface. And the period here is, I would say, back a ways in the 19th century. This is kind of the quintessential American popular performance form, but it extends into the late 19th century, and it included touring companies. So in other words, there were minstrel companies in all the big cities in the United States, but they also toured throughout the United States. There are various people involved, but the Irish are disproportionately represented in minstrelsy. And you can see from the image that it's a representation, not always a flattering representation, of other racial and ethnic groups, particularly African Americans. But I also wanted to point out, remind people, and the image on the right of your screen, the Burdett's Irish dialect recitations and readings, reminds us that the Irish were also targets of this kind of ethnic humor. In fact, the stage, what we call the stage Irishman, goes back as a character to the British stage and to Shakespeare, but was imported then to the United States, and Irish comic characters are populating stages in the United States well into the early 20th century. And it's important because what it tells us is that the Irish were interpreting this society, this very complex racial and ethnic society, to their audiences. And they found ways of doing that through music and comedy, but the effect was actually quite important. And we're switching now to a slide that focuses on music hall. And we're in a slightly later period. You have Edward Harrigan, the kind of central figure in American music hall. You have his dates here. And the high tide of music hall performance was the late 19th century. And Harrigan is also often referred to as the American Dickens, precisely because he focused on common people and the communities of common people and everyday life. Harrigan himself, he's in your image on the left here. He's in the light-colored uniform with the African-American youth between him and his collaborator, Hart, who's in the dark uniform on the left. Harrigan himself was a product of the Lower East Side. He was married to the granddaughter of a Jewish rabbi. He was fascinated with the diversity that he saw around him and realized that his audiences were as well. This was their life, and they were surrounded by people from all different ethnic groups, African Americans, Jews, Chinese, Italians, Germans, and so on. And these different ethnic groups all played a role in Harrigan's plays. Most of those were set in 5 points. That's the old Irish immigrant slum on the Lower East Side of New York, but it eventually came to be populated by a lot of different ethnic groups, and this is what Harrigan is representing in his performances. And when they asked him what he was trying to do, he often said that it was, he dealt with caricatures, he represented this with caricatures, and he represented it with humor, but he was trying to be realistic. He actually got his costumes from the streets of New York. He would go up to people on the street and offer to buy their clothes and use those in his performances. And on your right here, you have an example of one of his musical comedies, the Skidmore Guard. The Skidmore Guard was an African-American in Harrigan's plays, was an African-American marching society, and they were often in competition with the Mulligan Guard, which was an Irish immigrant marching society. And so he finds comic ways of dealing with this issue of ethnic difference and racial difference in the city, and people eat it up. Huge audiences turned out for these performances, and I think that tells you something. It tells you that people were quite interested in what they saw going on around them, and that they responded to Harrigan's characterization of these changes. This next slide deals with vaudeville, and on the left there, you'll have a caricature of the Irish. I think a lot of people in the AOH will probably be familiar with these kinds of caricatures. And this happens to be a lithograph, but it's part of the story of vaudeville. And roughly the period that we're talking about here is the late 19th century into the early 20th century. So say roughly the 1880s to the 1920s. Vaudeville was the quintessential urban working class form of theater. So the ethnic groups are turning out for this, and the middle class is turning out. They see the immigrants pouring into the city, and they're seeing on the vaudeville stage this mixture of people. The Irish are at the very center of vaudeville. The person, real life character that most people will probably be familiar with is George M. Cohan, who was both a performer and also an impresario, someone that put together vaudeville performances. But what you might not realize is that Cohan was just one example of a whole generation of vaudeville performers. And what you would most often see on a vaudeville stage is ethnic characterization and humor. It was what one historian has called ethnic cross-dressing, by which he meant that Irish performers would take on the persona of other ethnic groups, Blacks, Chinese, and so on. But other performers, Jewish vaudeville performers, for example, would take on the persona of the Irish. And this is where the stage Irishman really that character kind of flowers on the vaudeville stage, usually named Pat, usually more or less stupid, badly dressed, and so forth. But as I mentioned earlier, the stage Irishman, the institution of the stage Irishman really goes back all the way to Shakespeare. So it's an old institution. What was different in the early 20th century is the Irish began to object. I think they're rising in American society. They're concerned with their position in the society. They're better organized, and they begin to object to some of the more outrageous characterizations of the Irish on stage. There are actually riots that take place, a lot of protests and riots that take place at some of these performances, and some popular vaudeville acts were in effect driven off the stage by boycotts and by protests. And these tended to be organized by the AOH and by the United Irish Societies. And I think one of the things, the protests against performances like the Russell Brothers' Irish Servant Girl with the lovable but dumb Irish maid or cook, Bridget or Biddy. One of the things they're objecting to is a characterization, particularly of Irish women, that occupied a very important place and a revered place in Irish American society by this time. Earlier on, they seemed okay with not only attending these performances, but as I said, in many cases, performing in them, but they're much more aware of their position in American society, and they're beginning to object. There's a great quote from a vaudeville manager writing back to the main office, and he says, "Be careful about your comic stage Irishman routine, especially if that's an AOH town, if the Ancient Order of Hibernians are well organized there, because that's going to bring trouble." And in another message back to the office, he says that he would predict that other ethnic groups, like Hebrews, for example, he's talking about the Jewish community, you may find eventually that they're going to start objecting to these Hebrew and Black and Italian characters on stage. And as a matter of fact, the Anti-Defamation League was formed by Rabbi Hirsch in Chicago in 1911, partly on the model of these protests that the AOH and other groups had organized. So this slide is kind of the next period. We're talking about just one slide back. This is the Irish and the Jews. That's it. The picture on the left is a real place. That's around 23rd Street. So it's in Lower Manhattan. Tin Pan Alley was the source of popular music in the United States, roughly from the World War I period through the 1920s. And you would find most of the popular music of the time, what people were actually listening to, originating from this place. And it's not the sole preserve of the Irish. The most common pairing in the musical compositions was a Jewish partner and an Irish Catholic partner. And just in a minute, I just want to quickly read a couple of examples of this to you, but I want to belabor the main point here, which is that we're once again interpreting urban society, and especially the relations between the different ethnic groups from, in part at least, an Irish perspective. And here's just a couple of examples. Let me put my flashlight on here so I can see. The first example is a Tin Pan Alley song that's called The Kellys, and it's from the early years of the 20th century. And it's supposed to be, based on a real experience of a young immigrant coming from Cork to New York City, and he encounters both the ubiquitous Irish and their diverse neighbors. I went to the directory, me uncle for to find, but I found so many Kellys, I nearly lost me mind. So I went to ask directions from a friendly German Jew, but he says, "Please excuse me, but my name is Kelly too. Dan Kelly runs the railroads, John Kelly runs the seas, Kate Kelly runs the suffragettes, and she looks right good to me." Well, I went and asked directions from a naturalized Chinese, but he says, "Please excuse me, but me name is Kelly." So this is a celebration, in a way, of the position of the Irish, but again, in relation to the other ethnic groups in the city. And one of the most famous of these was a song called If It Weren't for the Irish and the Jews. And this is a pairing, a team, a songwriting team of, it was published in 1912, of William Jerome, which is would be recognized, I think, as a Jewish name, but actually his name was William Flannery, and his partner's name was Gene Schwartz. This is If It Weren't for the Irish and the Jews. Talk about a combination. Hear my words and make a note. On St. Patrick's Day, Rosinski pins a shamrock on his coat. There's a sympathetic feeling between the blooms and the McAdoos. Why Tammany would surely fall. There really would be no hall at all if it weren't for the Irish and the Jews. On the right there, you have really, by far, the most popular play of the 1920s, but its reach extends actually beyond the 1920s. It was made into a television show in the late 1940s. This is Abby's Irish Rose, and the story is the love affair and marriage of a second generation Irish American guy, Jewish American guy with an Irish American woman, Rose, and the problems that causes with the earlier generation, both on the Jewish side and on the Irish side, but also sympathetic, more tolerant Irish American priest brings the families together. The marriage is happy. This play ran not only in New York City on Broadway, but in Chicago and other large cities, the longest of any at the time. It set all kinds of records. There were songs that came out of it and so forth. And so when I encountered this, I wanted to think a little bit about why this is happening, because this pairing was very common. It's unexpected in a way. You might expect there to be more tension between the two communities, but it shows up in songs. And there was a popular baseball pairing on the Chicago White Sox of a Jewish guy and an Irish Catholic guy that roomed together and of course played together on the team. So it's very common. And I don't think we know for sure exactly why this was so popular, but one possible explanation is curiosity. Particularly in the second generation, these people encountering one another in the city and trying to figure all this out. A certain affinity. You have two historically oppressed groups, Irish Catholics and Russian and East European Jews, who had experienced a lot of travail. Maybe some anxiety about intermarriage. That's an anxiety certainly in the Jewish community, and could also be in the Irish Catholic community. But for whatever reason, it's playing itself out on stage, and it's extremely popular. People are responding to it. This next slide is on film. And I wanted to at least briefly gesture to a couple of different things here. One is the image of the Irish American in film. And on the left here, you have Jimmy Cagney, fantastically popular, especially in the 1930s, but well beyond. Cagney grew up on the Lower East Side. He spoke Yiddish. He didn't speak Irish. He spoke English and a bit of Yiddish, and was the character, especially in the 30s. The big film, Public Enemy, that really made his career is set in the old Irish neighborhood of Bridgeport in Chicago, and is extremely popular. And you find this as well in what you might think of as the some of the Hollywood glamour girls, someone like Maureen O'Hara. So the point here is that not just Irish Americans, but people from a lot of different ethnic backgrounds who are shaped as much by film as probably any other element in American popular culture, are to some extent looking toward Irish American characters as kind of models and to some extent emulating them. You know, what immigrant kid growing up in a city in the early 20th century, the Depression era, did not identify with the tough, Irish American character of somebody like Cagney. And then secondly, on your right here on this slide, the image on the right is an image of the Legion of Decency. And this organization is established in 1934 by Irish Catholics. And some of the older people, Dan Taylor and some of the other people here are probably too young, but I grew up with the Legion of Decency's list of films, and it categorized the films according to whether they were acceptable morally. And it's estimated, if you think this might not be important, it's estimated that by 1938, once the Legion of Decency had been going for a while, these lists incidentally are published in all the Catholic newspapers. So people did, to the extent that they read their diocesan newspaper, they got these lists. And by 1938, it's estimated that about 98% of Hollywood films were vetted by the Legion of Decency. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Legion of Decency approved of every one of those films, but it does mean that Hollywood producers and directors paid attention to what the Catholic Church pronounced about their films. The lists for me were in the New World, which was a Catholic newspaper in Chicago. And I told somebody the other night, I was a little afraid that the guys I grew up with looked at the list for the condemned films to see what they would like to try to see at the movie the next week. But I do think that most people took it seriously. And one Sunday a year, you were asked to pledge that you would observe the Legion of Decency's lists. So these are two different ways that Irish Americans influenced American film. And with regard to this issue of censorship, if you're inclined to take a negative view of that, you should at least recognize that what it means is that Irish Catholics who ran this effort did become moral arbiters in a way of the film industry. And as I say, I can't think of many other influences in American society that were more important. And the last substantive film I have here, the image, is on urban realist writers. So you have on the right here, one of these people, there's actually several. You might think of Eugene O'Neill, the playwright, or you might think of John O'Hara. I think the person that really captures this influence best is James II Farrell. And Farrell's dates are there, so you can sort of place him. And he published more than 20 books. But I think in many ways, the one that may be the most significant, I think it's definitely the most popular, but I think it also probably had the most significance in the context that I'm suggesting here, is his trilogy called Studs Lonigan, which was published between 1932 and 1935. And Farrell himself represents kind of at that moment, the early 20th century, the Depression period, the two different ends of Irish American society. His father was a Teamster. This is on the south side of Chicago. He grew up in poverty, but he was taken in by his grandparents and raised part of the time by them. And they were definitely what most of you might call lace curtain Irish in Chicago. The middle class was referred to as steam heat Irish because they had better heating in their apartments. So he also saw the rising Irish American middle class. And one of the things this book captures best is the anxiety of the generation in that situation, both the status anxiety of people trying to rise out of poverty and out of the working class into the middle class, which of course most Irish Americans ended up being able to do eventually, but not at that moment. Things were much more, there was much more tension involved in the situation. And we're talking about the south side of Chicago. And so the book also captures the anxiety over race relations as Black migrants came into the city. And of course, you know, what happened in Chicago happened in most other large cities as well. The changes in neighborhoods. So the Irish are just about making it and coming into a more respectable middle-class neighborhood, and then the neighborhood begins to change racially. And I can't claim that it's a happy novel, but it's an excellent novel, and it really represents another influence of the Irish. In this case, in terms of urban realist kind of literature, which is not necessarily where you would expect to find them. The last image that I have here, I'm going to stop talking in a minute, intentionally shows a large crowd. That's it. So this is in downtown Chicago. It's one of the large immigrant rights demonstrations. I think this is 1906. And you can see the American flags there, but you can also see the Mexican flags. And I'm ending with this image for a reason. If you went downtown on this day, you would find the expected, which would be these Mexican flags and mariachi bands and so forth. You would also find, Korean drummers, and you would find Polish and Ukrainian dancers and so forth. But you would also find Irish pipers and Irish step dancers. And I think what it suggests, once again, is this connection of the Irish and now mostly settled Irish Americans with the issue of immigration and with other immigrant peoples. And so what I've tried to suggest over the last half hour or whatever it's been is the ways in which Irish Americans really interpreted American society for newcomers coming in, and in the process and in engaging with these other groups in the church, in the street, in political organizations, on stage, help to create a new, diverse, multi-ethnic urban culture, which is, I think, what you find in most of our cities by the middle of the 20th century. So I think I'll end there. I'm happy to take questions and to stick around with you for a while.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Barrett. And I do have a few questions or some things I'd like to highlight from your classic treatment of this subject. And you mentioned that it always wasn't pretty on the streets. There's really not an image of the Irish holding hands and singing songs with these new immigrant groups at all times. But there were areas and ways in which Irish America, looking out for itself and its own interests, also sort of lent a hand to others. And you mentioned immigration, where the AOH and other groups that were pushing back against nativist resistance to Irish immigration also embraced the defense of other immigrant groups from other countries coming to the United States. You also mentioned in your book one of the interesting episodes that people sometimes enjoy hearing about. The Ku Klux Klan in the 20s, of course, was rabidly anti-Catholic, anti-Black, anti-Jewish. And you note in your book that the AOH and other like organizations pushed back against the KKK, not just in defense of Catholics or Irish Catholics, but in defense of all of the minorities that were being attacked by the Klan at that time.
Yeah, I think that the Ku Klux Klan had the poor judgment of targeting a lot of different groups. This is basically, at the risk of casting aspersions, this is largely a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant organization. And they're thought about more recently, like during the Civil Rights Movement, as mainly anti-Black. And that was certainly true, especially in the South. But they were also anti-immigrant. And of course, there's a long tradition of anti-Catholicism in the United States, and the Klan was in some ways only the most recent organization to embrace that. So yeah, I think that to some extent, the Irish Americans were defending themselves and their own immigrant group, but what that meant in practice was that it brought them together with other groups. And it's, the Klan is an extreme case, but maybe more importantly, you can find that in other settings as well. The relations on the streets of the Lower East Side and where I'm from, which is the west side of Chicago, between Irish Catholics and Jews was not always good. But there is an affinity there. It's really unmistakable. And I think that you would find Jewish representatives, rabbis, and others at Knights of Columbus and AOH functions. And I think you would find Irish Catholics, especially clergy, at Jewish celebrations as well. So, yeah, there is an affinity, I think, between the groups.
In fact, you mentioned Rabbi Hirsch, the founder of the Anti-Defamation League, and suggested that his efforts and the efforts of the ADL were modeled to some extent on Irish pushback against the stage Irishmen. You also note in your chapter on that subject that Rabbi Hirsch considered himself to be an Irishman by adoption, and it would not be unusual to see him at Chicago's Irish Fellowship Club. So they're not only are they following the model, but there's a direct connection.
Yeah. And I think it's one of the ways that it helps to take a look at the Irish in this context of the other ethnic and racial groups, because I think, you'll find conflict, but I think some people may be surprised to find more cooperation and affinity than they might have expected to. In a different place, I pointed out maybe because of the relatively large proportion of women in the Irish immigration, but whether for that reason or for other reasons, the rate of intermarriage with other groups, while still relatively low. The Irish Catholics tended to marry other Irish Catholics, but over a period of time, intermarriage between Irish Americans and other ethnic groups is higher than it is for other people from other immigrant backgrounds, suggesting, it seems, a certain level of tolerance that they may not always get credit for.
Another area that you touch on is the Catholic schools. And as you noted, the schools were staffed by Irish Catholic religious and lay persons. And you detail in the book how there was sort of a transformation over the years. Originally, these schools were created by Irish Catholics, mostly poor, to educate their own children. And then as the Irish moved up in society, so to speak, these schools became, in many cases, sort of elite educational centers for a new class of lawyers and doctors and leaders in the community. But also, and I think we see this today still, the Catholic schools that the Irish created are now educating people from all backgrounds, mostly in many cases urban, less advantaged people who otherwise wouldn't receive this sort of high quality education.
Yeah, I think these schools start as schools mostly to educate working class immigrant youth. And I think in many cases, in the case of the city schools, they remain that. But the ethnic complexion of the student bodies change. My father graduated from St. Ignatius High School in the west side of Chicago, which was mostly Irish and Italian when he went in the 20s, early 30s. But that school is extremely mixed now. It's an old Jesuit school. It's one of the best in the state. And now it has a relatively large Latino population, especially, but also Black student population, and still people coming in from the suburbs and from other neighborhoods because it's a very good school. So, yeah, I think you can reproduce that in other cities and in other educational institutions.
One other image that in the book that I have to mention refers to the Black nationalist Marcus Garvey. And you paint this picture in 1920 when Ireland is involved in the struggle for independence. Marcus Garvey has a gathering of 20,000 African Americans. And as you recount, he reads out loud a letter from himself to Eamon de Valera, in which he endorses and supports freedom and self-determination for the Irish people. And as you relate, the crowd of 20,000 African Americans goes wild after the reading in support of the sentiments of the letter.
Well, it's, a 30-second remembering of Irish history in this case is, the Easter Rebellion and what was eventually a successful revolution against the British and the establishment of an independent republic. That's a model for a lot of people. It's not just African Americans. There are Eastern European nationalists, Jews interested in establishing a homeland in Palestine that are influenced a lot by the Irish model. And there are cases of Irish Americans who cooperated with some of these groups to help establish similar kind of movements. So yeah, I think it's at that moment, historians are here partly to remind you of why the past is important, and if not forever, at that moment in the wake of the Irish Revolution, I think it was an important image for a lot of different people throughout the world.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor. I don't know, Danny, if we have any questions coming in from the audience.
We have a question from YouTube, which kind of goes towards the end of this discussion, and it's from Patrick McCarthy, who says it was a great discussion today. And can you discuss the drift from the Democrat Party to the GOP, starting with the wealth and prosperity of post-World War II America and their support for Joe McCarthy? And that was an area right at the end of what you're touching on, Professor. You have any words there for our friend Patrick?
Yeah, I'm going to be intentionally brief because it brings me into the dangerous terrain of contemporary politics. And I won't presume too much, but I'm going to guess I'm pretty far to the left of many of the people listening tonight. So briefly, the important part of the story is not my politics, but the Irish have moved up. They've moved out to a considerable extent. There are Irish neighborhoods in a lot of cities in the United States, but not like there was in the late 19th and early 20th century. As they've moved up in the social structure, the appeal of the Republican Party, especially on issues of taxes, business regulation, other things, have appealed more to the Irish. But if I could put in a plug for a different vantage point on this, all that is true. You can see it in the voting statistics. I sometimes tell people that these are signs of the end of the world, where Jews and Irish Catholics are voting for the Republican Party. But, I grew up in Chicago and there were not two parties. There was basically just one party. And the Irish created that party and, for a long time stuck with it. And I think that you will still find two of my brothers are business people, and they're more inclined to the at least the old Republican Party. I don't know about the current Republican Party, but they still have elements of this old sort of progressive tradition in the Irish American community. And some of that, at least, I would argue, comes from the church. I think
yes.
The influence of the church is a preference for the poor and, a help for the poor and for social reform and so forth. So the closest I can get to a neutral response to a very good question.
That was a very good response, Professor.
It's a mixed picture. It's a mixed picture. Yeah.
It gives us a great segue into the AOH in our politics. And I think that the creators of the AOH and the people who put together our Constitution were genius. By Constitution, the AOH does not support any political party or candidate. And at the same time, they specifically say we're not allowed to oppose any political party or candidate. And I think that's one of the genius. It allows us as a fraternal Irish Catholic organization to stick to the issues at hand. And when we're working on immigration, we work with everybody who's on our side with immigration. When we're working on a United Ireland, We work with everybody that's on our side. When we're working on the church issues such as pro-life, we're working on everybody that's on our side. And really one of the top issues that's been start to finish with the AOH is immigration. And I think that the leadership of the AOH back in the times you're discussing was smart enough to know that, and they set the stage for us in the future. Dan, anything else you have before we conclude?
I'm going to give one more question to the professor. Professor, in your introduction, you quote a Jewish writer as saying that the immigrant Jews admired the Irish and the Irish alone. And he says the Irish were the cops and the firemen and the ball players, and these were the figures that Jewish immigrants wanted to emulate. I think it's well established that the Irish immigrant and first and second and third generation Irish American ethos, if you will, was a very patriotic, pro-American ethos. And they had sort of the ability to look back to Ireland and to retain some Irishness and some things that came from the culture of their forebears. But they were first and foremost patriotic Americans. Did that sort of outlook of Irish America have an influence on subsequent immigrant groups as they looked to what it meant to become an American?
So I think the most important observation may be pretty simple, which is new people coming into society are trying to figure it out and how they fit in. And the big question, it's a very old question that goes back all the way to Grocœur, the French visitor here in the United States in the early Republic period, which is, what is an American? And I think that what people saw as American was the Irish. And I think this patriotism that you're talking about is one element of that. But there's all kinds of other things as well. There's the language, there's the politics, there's the way of making it in American urban society. Whatever else you want to say about the Irish in the 20th century, they were making it. They had managed to generate a certain amount of power and influence. They were leading a lot of institutions of urban society. And I think that first of all, that helps to explain the patriotism that you're talking about. I mean, it's a system that paid off pretty well for the Irish, but I think it also helps to explain why later peoples tended to pay attention to the Irish and to some extent, follow the model because it seemed to be working.
Very good. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
Okay. Any closing comments, Professor, before we go into our close? We're reaching our hour here. So,
yeah. So all I would say is that certain elements of my family will be very impressed with the fact that it was the Ancient Order of Hibernians that asked me to give a little talk. A lot of times they're not quite as impressed with my station in society as I would like them to be. Sometimes I have to remind them, I'm a professor at a big research university. That they're not too interested in that. They're not easily impressed. So yeah, I appreciate the invitation. I will point this out to them the next time we get together.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to congratulate you and congratulate Dan Taylor and thank Dan for all of his work on our Irish American Heritage Month videos. I'd like to remind all of our guests that the Ancient Order Hibernian YouTube channel will have this video in about 5 minutes. You'll be able to watch it again. We anticipate it being a feature at our meetings in the next upcoming weeks. And we encourage everyone to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You get the information on our events. As Dan mentioned, our first event is on there, and our next event, the week after St. Patrick's Day, is going to be about Father Flanagan and Boys Town. And Father Flanagan, as you may or may not know, was a member of the Ancient Order Hibernian. So, Professor, your family may want to join us. And in closing, we're going to go back to the video we began with that features Neil Cosgrove's video that he put together this year for Irish American Heritage Month. Thank you all for joining us.
A journalist visiting America in 1860 wrote,
There are several kinds of power working at the fabric of this republic: water power, steam power, and Irish power. The last works hardest of all. Irish Americans continue to power America, from building our infrastructure, to healing the sick, to rushing into harm's way as others run out. Irish names are prominent on all our rolls of valor, including 257 recipients of the Medal of Honor that list Ireland as their birthplace. Without Irish Americans, Helen Keller would not have had her miracle worker. The marginalized would have lost a voice. We would not have been challenged to reach for the moon. But the most significant contribution of Irish Americans is the story of a people who arrived from their homeland with little more than energy and determination, who have contributed and excelled in every aspect of American society, defining the American dream. March is Irish